Nobody wanted the Relic. It had been sitting in the back corner of Yen Marek Station salvage bay for 11 years, a massive, incomprehensible machine roughly the size of a ground transport, covered in a material no spectrometer had ever successfully classified, etched with geometric patterns that shifted almost imperceptibly depending on the angle of light hitting its surface. 3 separate alien engineering teams had examined it over the years. 2 had declared it inert and irreparable, their instruments returning contradictory data that their senior analysts eventually attributed to sensor malfunction rather than confront the unsettling alternative, that the machine was doing something to the readings on purpose. The 3rd team had simply refused to continue after their lead technician reported hearing something when he pressed his hand against the hull. Not a sound exactly. More like a feeling shaped like a word, originating from somewhere deep inside the machine and arriving not through his ears but through the center of his chest, warm and deliberate and unmistakably intentional. He had resigned his post the following morning. He never explained why, and no one who had seen his face when he walked out of that salvage bay ever pushed him for an answer. So the Relic sat, gathering dust, taking up space, annoying the station quartermaster every time inventory season came around and he had to log it again as unclassified salvage, condition unknown, value indeterminate, disposition pending. 11 years of pending. The machine did not seem to mind. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Marcus Vale was not supposed to be on Yen Marek at all. He had been rerouted after a cargo dispute, the kind of ugly, bureaucratic collision of broken contracts and disputed manifests that happened constantly in the outer station networks, left his transport assignment dissolved somewhere between departure and destination. He had arrived at Yen Marek with 40 credits, a toolkit that was older than most of the junior crew aboard the station, and the particular brand of patient stubbornness that seemed to run in human blood like a secondary genetic code, something evolution had quietly installed alongside the obvious survival instincts, the kind that made humans annoying to deal with and nearly impossible to permanently discourage. He was 31 years old. He had been fixing things since he was 8. Not because someone told him to, but because broken things bothered him on a level he had never fully been able to articulate, a low-grade discomfort that sat behind his eyes when he looked at something that wasn't working the way it was meant to, a discomfort that only eased when he understood what was wrong and set it right. His father had been the same. A weathered engineer from the lunar shipyards outside Tycho Station, the kind of man who talked to engines the way other people talk to old friends, who believed with quiet certainty that every machine had a logic and that logic could be found if you were patient enough to stop thinking about what you wanted to do and start paying attention to what the machine was telling you. Marcus had grown up with grease under his fingernails and that lesson installed so deeply it had become instinct. He did not fix things for money, though the money was useful. He fixed things because leaving something broken felt wrong in a way he could not ignore. He had taken the only work available on Yen Marek, salvage bay maintenance, bottom tier, the kind of job where they handed you a diagnostic scanner, pointed you at the pile of things no one else wanted to deal with, and left you to figure out what could be salvaged and what needed to be jettisoned. On his first day they gave him a row of decommissioned atmospheric processors. On his second day, 3 alien navigation units of a model so outdated the manufacturer no longer existed. On his third day, the quartermaster walked him to the back corner of the bay, gestured at the enormous, pattern-covered machine sitting in the dust, said, "Don't break anything that isn't already broken," and walked away. The implication was clear. This was not a real repair assignment. It was a way of keeping the new human occupied while the senior staff decided whether to finally stop pretending the Relic was going to reveal its secrets and simply schedule it for the next waste disposal run. Marcus understood this. He did not take offense. He set his toolkit down, pulled up a stool, and spent the first hour simply looking at the machine. That was always how he started. His father's first lesson, absorbed so early it felt like breathing: look before you touch. Understand the whole before you address the parts. A machine is trying to tell you something and it will keep trying until you are ready to hear it. Most people skip the listening and go straight to the doing, and most people spend twice as long fixing things as a result. He ran his diagnostic scanner across the hull surface and received readings that contradicted themselves in ways that should not have been physically possible. The material registered as both metallic and organic depending on which wavelength the scanner used, shifting classification mid-reading as though it could not decide what it wanted to be, or as though it was actively resisting being categorized. The internal structure showed dense, interlocking layers of components that his scanner's mapping function could not fully resolve, not because the resolution was too low, but because the components themselves appeared to be moving slightly each time the sensor sweep passed over them. Micro-adjustments. Continuous, tiny realignments, as though the machine was orienting itself toward something, or away from something, in constant quiet motion, too small to see but not too small to detect. Most people would have stopped there. Filed a report noting the anomalous readings. Flagged it for someone more senior. Moved on. Marcus put the scanner down. He pulled his stool closer and began tracing the geometric patterns on the hull with his fingertips. The patterns were not decorative. He understood this within minutes, the understanding arriving not as a conclusion from evidence but as something more immediate. The way you understand that a door is meant to open before you can explain how you know, a recognition that bypasses reasoning and arrives as simple fact. The geometric lines were functional. They were channels, pathways designed to carry something through the body of the machine the way blood vessels carried blood or conduit carried current. He did not know what they were meant to carry. Energy possibly. Information maybe. Something that existed in a category between the two that human science had not yet fully defined. But the intent was clear once you stopped trying to classify the lines and simply followed where they went. He traced them with his eyes the way you trace a river system on a map, following tributaries back toward their source, finding where the flow converged, identifying the point where everything met. It took him 40 minutes. The station around him continued its ordinary work. The distant clang of equipment, the hum of atmospheric systems, the occasional voice from the far end of the bay. Marcus heard none of it. He was following the channels, patient and focused, the way his father had taught him, the way that had always eventually delivered the answer if he was willing to wait for it. The convergence point was small, circular, recessed into the hull at the precise geometric center of the entire pattern system, set deep enough that you would never notice it unless you were specifically looking for where every line eventually led. It was not labeled. It was not obvious. It was simply there, waiting, invisible to everyone who had looked at the machine's surface and tried to understand it by analyzing its parts rather than reading its whole. Marcus pressed his thumb into it without making a conscious decision to do so. It felt, afterward, less like a choice and more like the natural completion of a sentence. The period at the end of 40 minutes of reading. The relic woke up. Not dramatically. Not with the explosive surge of light and power that the entertainment broadcasts always used when ancient machines activated in their stories. It woke up the way a person wakes up after a very long sleep, carefully, slowly, with a particular quality of attention that belongs to a consciousness finding its bearings after extended absence. Marcus felt it before he saw it, felt it the way you feel a large engine begin to turn in a room nearby, a vibration below the threshold of sound, a hum that started somewhere beneath the floor and moved upward through the stool, through his legs, through his torso, settling into his chest with a warmth that was not temperature but something adjacent to it. Something that felt, in a way he could not explain, like recognition. Then the geometric patterns on the hull began to glow. Soft gold at first, barely brighter than the ambient light, easy to dismiss as reflection. Then deepening, amber, copper, the specific warm color of old light coming through very old glass in a building that had been standing longer than anyone alive could remember. The lines that had been shifting and restless resolved themselves into perfect stillness, each one locking into its final position with a precision that felt deliberate, felt chosen, as though the machine was deciding, for the first time in a very long time, to be fully and clearly seen. Marcus stood slowly from his stool. Not out of fear, there was no fear in him, which was itself a thing worth noting, but out of the specific reverence that rises in a person when they are in the presence of something that has been waiting, and has now found what it was waiting for. The bay around him had gone quiet. The other workers at the far end had stopped what they were doing. Marcus did not notice. His entire attention was on the machine, on the warmth in his chest that was deepening, becoming more specific, becoming something that his mind reached toward the word communication to describe without quite arriving there. Then it arrived. Not through his ears. Through his chest, the same channel as the warmth, meaning delivered directly into his understanding the way light delivers color. Not a translation of something but the thing itself, perfectly received. Diagnostic scan complete. Biological identifier recognized. Authentication confirmed. Marcus blinked. The words, not quite words but close enough that his mind shaped them into that form automatically, settled through him like stones dropping into still water, each one sending its own set of rings outward. He said, aloud in the quiet of the salvage bay, authentication of what? The patterns on the hull pulsed once. Deep and warm. The light intensified slightly and then settled, as though the machine had taken a breath. You carry the marker. A sequence encoded in your cellular architecture at the base level, below what your science currently maps. It was placed in your lineage by the architects, the civilization that built me, before your world had a name. A signature. A key. Not every human carries it. It emerges rarely and only in those whose minds work in a particular way. Those who look at a thing and read it as a whole before they touch any part of it. Those who listen before they act. The architects called them keeper minds. I was built to find one. Marcus sat back down on his stool. His hands were on his knees and they were completely steady. This was another human trait that occasionally confused the species that shared the galactic neighborhood with them. That capacity to absorb enormous information, to have the universe fundamentally rearranged around them, and remain functionally calm while the rearrangement was processed. Other species called it shock. The humans who possessed it called it focus. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "What are you?" "I am a throne engine. The last one in existence. I was built by the architects as the final piece of a network. A system of 17,000 installations spread across 400 star systems. Ships. Research stations. Archive vaults containing knowledge your civilization has not yet developed the framework to conceive. Defense platforms. Construction arrays. All of it built across a period of time your calendar would measure in tens of thousands of years, all of it connected through a central command architecture, all of it dark and waiting since the architects chose to end their physical presence in this galaxy." Chose to end? Marcus repeated. They did not die. They did not lose a war. They completed something. A transition that organic minds in their early stages of development do not yet have the vocabulary to describe accurately. They left. But before they did, they built me. And they seeded the marker into a small number of human bloodlines. They had been watching your world for a long time. They had decided that if any species in this galaxy was going to eventually be capable of receiving what they were leaving behind, it would be the ones who fixed things. The ones who looked at what was broken and felt compelled, not rewarded, not instructed, but compelled, to understand it and restore it. The salvage bay was completely silent now. Marcus was distantly aware that several people had gathered at the edge of his peripheral vision. Station workers who had seen the light, who had drifted over without fully deciding to, but he did not turn toward them. He was holding the conversation with the same focused patience he brought to every repair, moving through it piece by piece, following the logic the way he had followed the channels on the hull. 17,000 installations, he said. All dormant. All waiting for a keeper signal. Which I can now transmit with your authorization. Every installation in the network will receive the signal and begin its activation sequence. This process will take time, years for the most distant nodes. But the first installations to wake will do so within hours. And what happens after that? That, the throne engine said, and something in the quality of the response shifted, became warmer, became the specific warmth of something moving from function to genuine communication, is entirely your decision. The network has no agenda of its own. It is a tool. The most sophisticated tool ever built in this galaxy, but a tool nonetheless. It was built to serve a keeper mind. To be directed by someone who understands that understanding must come before action. The architects were very specific about that. They did not want the network activated by ambition or by accident or by force. They wanted it found by someone who would sit in a salvage bay with a 40-credit account and spend an hour simply looking at something before they touched it. Marcus was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that the workers gathered at the edge of his vision began exchanging glances. Long enough that the quartermaster arrived, having been called by someone who thought something had gone wrong, and stood at the perimeter of the light looking at the glowing machine and the human sitting in front of it with his hands on his knees and his expression somewhere between very far away and very precisely present. Marcus was thinking about his father. About the lunar shipyards and the long hours in the machine bays and the lessons delivered in the particular shorthand of people who communicate better through demonstration than through words. He was thinking about a ship his father had once restored from components that two separate yards had condemned, a vessel so comprehensively broken that its original owners had written it off their inventory before they even finished the damage assessment. His father had spent 4 months on it. He had talked to it the entire time. He had been laughed at for that, by people who did not understand that talking to a machine is not about believing it can hear you. It is about organizing your own thinking. It is about making yourself responsible, out loud, for what you are doing and why. He was thinking about the 40 credits in his account and the dissolved contract and the job that had been handed to him as an afterthought, a way of keeping the human occupied. He was thinking about how many times in the history of his species someone had handed a human a problem as an afterthought, as a way of getting them out from underfoot, and the human had come back with something that changed the equation entirely. He was thinking that the architects, whoever and whatever they had been, had understood something true about humanity. Not that humans were the strongest, or the fastest, or the most technologically advanced species in the galaxy. Not that they were the most intelligent by any conventional measure. But that they were the ones who, when handed a broken thing and told not to make it worse, would sit down in front of it, look at it until they understood it, and then quietly and methodically fix it. He looked up at the machine. The golden light pulsed softly, patient, waiting. "I have some conditions," Marcus said. "State them." "The network doesn't get used as a weapon. Not against any species. Not preemptively, not retaliatorily, not defensively in ways that expand into offense. The research archives open to every civilization that wants access. Not as leverage, not as trade material, freely. If any installation can help a species that's struggling, food, medicine, technology, shelter, that gets prioritized over anything else. These parameters are recorded and set as primary directives. They cannot be overridden without your explicit authorization. And no one finds out about this from the network itself. No transmissions announcing what happened here. If this information goes out, it goes out on my terms, on a timeline I choose, in a way that doesn't start a war over who controls it." "Understood." "Transmission protocols restricted to keeper authorization only." Marcus nodded once. The nod of a man completing the terms of a reasonable agreement, the same nod he gave when he and a client had settled on a repair scope and a price. He reached out and pressed his hand flat against the hull of the throne engine, palm open, the way you put your hand on the hull of a ship you're about to take responsibility for. The warmth that moved through him then was different from the earlier warmth. It was the warmth of something settling into place. Of a connection completing. Of a machine that had been waiting longer than his civilization had existed, finally finding the hands it had been built to find. "Authentication complete," the throne engine said. "Keeper bond established. Network activation sequence initiated." Somewhere in the galaxy, in the cold dark of dead star systems, on the surfaces of worlds no living species had visited in millennia, in the deep space between systems where ancient installations had been drifting in darkness for longer than human history, 17,000 lights began to turn on. "Welcome home, my king." Marcus Vale sat in a salvage bay on Yen Merrick Station, in a corner where unwanted things were left to be forgotten. His toolkit was on his knee. His hand was on the hull of the most powerful machine ever built. Behind him, the station quartermaster was making a sound that was not quite words yet. The workers who had gathered at the edge of the light were very still, watching something they would describe for the rest of their lives and never fully find the language for. Marcus looked at the throne engine. He looked at his toolkit. He looked at the light spreading across the hull like sunrise over a world seeing its first day. "All right," he said, quiet and steady and completely certain, the voice of a man who had never needed the universe to tell him he belonged somewhere to know that he did. "Let's get to work." He had 17,000 installations waiting. He had 400 star systems worth of dormant, patient, ancient machinery. He had a galaxy full of broken things. He knew exactly what to do with that.